هذه الجلسة الصباحية مخصصة لموضوع سياسات مواجهة فيروس كوفيد 19 في شمال إفريقيا، جدلية الديمقراطية والسلطوية. كان يفترض أن يلقي الكلمة الأساسية والمحاضرة الأساسية في هذه الجلسة الأستاذ العربي الصديقي، وأظن أن فارق الوقت ربما هو الذي أحال دون أن يكون جاهزا الآن. ننتقل إلى الجلسة العادية التي تتضمن 3 مداخلات يشارك فيها الأستاذة مريم الخضم من جامعة سيدي محمد بن عبد الله بفاس. أيضا هناك مداخلة مشتركة بين إسبانيا وإيطاليا، معنا بياتريس تومي ألونسو وجوليا سيميني. وأيضا من فرنسا معنا أمال أبو بكر، باحث في مدرسة الدراسات العليا في العلوم الاجتماعية. إذن دون الإطالة أعطي الكلمة للمتدخلة الأولى الأستاذة مريم الخضر. كل المداخلات ستكون أعتقد باللغة الإنجليزية، على الأقل مداخلتين الأولى والثانية وربما حتى الثالثة. الترجمة متوفرة، لذلك سوف أقتصر على التسيير باللغة العربية. الأستاذة مريم الخضر عنوان مداخلتها: تدبير أزمة فيروس كورونا، الأنظمة السلطوية مقابل الأنظمة الديمقراطية. كما اتفقنا البارحة، فلكل مداخلة سواء كانت منفردة أو مشتركة 15 دقيقة. فلك الكلمة الأستاذة مريم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. قبل البدء أود أن أتقدم بالشكر الخالص للأشخاص الذين عملوا بإخلاص من أجل إنجاح هذا المحفل العلمي، وكذا على تمكيني من المشاركة في ندوة بهذا الثقل المعرفي. إذا سمحتم لي سوف أعطي تلخيص بسيط جدا للورقة التي قدمتها، والتي تطرقت لموضوع مدى نجاح بعض الأنظمة السلطوية في التصدي لجائحة كورونا وفشل بعض الأنظمة الديمقراطية في ذلك. بينما الجزء الثاني من الورقة تحدث عن التدابير المتخذة في شمال إفريقيا وتماشيها مع المعاهدات الدولية. لذلك من أجل احترام الوقت سوف أتطرق للشق الأخير من الجزء الثاني من الورقة التي قدمتها. سوف تكون مداخلتي بالإنجليزية إذا سمحتم. So, as we know, in North Africa, the pandemic has been relatively slow to materialize, and governments have had time to prepare before the spread of the virus. The government adopted several measures to counter the threat, among which the deployment of military, containment, curfews, closure of schools, among others. So actually, while other countries suffered deeply from the health crisis, Morocco and Tunisia stood out for their fairness and responsiveness in decision-making. Another thing is that they relied on the cooperation of an informed public, which is in fact one of the main characteristics of a healthy democracy. Government actually had addressed people with respect and responsiveness. Social distancing has succeeded not out of fear, but through hard-earned public trust, transparent communication, and cooperation with civil societies. Morocco's set of restrictions actually seemed extremely hard in an effort to protect the country, to ensure national security and public health, which was actually as the top priorities of the government. The state of emergency imposed some drastic measures which actually come against the paragraph 4 of the Constitution, especially Articles 21 to 24. Fines and arrests targeted people who did not comply to imperatives of policies. Hence to that, Moroccan authorities have arrested people for spreading rumors on COVID-19, which is once again opposed to the Article 25 of the Constitution. In this context, several critics have denounced the harsh measures as oppressive policies that come against the democracy in Morocco. The Egyptian government was severely criticized for its unwillingness to provide detailed data on the distribution of cases with coronavirus, whether data on the number of infected people, infected women, the elderly, or on the basis of poverty level or infections by governorates. The Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights addressed reports in which it declares that there are no available statistics on COVID-19 related deaths in Egyptian prisons, despite the fact that the government released several reports attesting the opposite, but they remain uncertain. Mary Lawler, who is Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights activists in Egypt, asserts that there are credible allegations that some Egyptian activists have been arrested, arbitrarily detained, forcibly disappeared or tortured simply for standing up for democracy. The same report outlines that Egypt is using the health crisis as an alibi for proceeding to arbitrary detentions of all several opponents of the regime of Sisi. Hence to that, she resumes the report saying that the government methods of detention and trials violates international human rights standards. Meanwhile, same critiques have been addressed to the Algerian government, which uses the measures put in place in order to fight the pandemic to keep opponents in silence, such as the arrest of prominent journalists for undermining national unity and damage to the morale of the army. Besides, the Algerian courts postponed some proceedings but kept dealing with the cases against anti-government activists. And once again, terrorism laws used by the government are once again using to arrest journalists, to block websites, internet, and to block access to information for most of the citizens. According to Kevin Casas-Zamora, Secretary General of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, he asserts that the case of some North African states is well acceptable. The case of Tunisia. Tunisia had not imposed any abusive measures. Most countries have used emergency powers in a reasonable way so far. Morocco, despite the intervention of the military and the circulation of armored vehicles in the street, has in no way resorted to abusive arrests or threats against citizens. In the same report, he declares that leaders who are more autocratic might take advantage of the situation in order to extend their powers, such as the case of Sisi in Egypt and same case in Algeria. So what I think that we don't have to overlook is that most of human rights are not as absolute as let's say, the right to life, the freedom from slavery or from torture, but they can be restricted with some limitations. These limitations are made into several provisions of, for example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in several articles, like, for example, Article 4, 12, 18, 19, 21, and 22. Hence to that, we have the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which also sets the same rights of individuals in 4 articles precisely, and outlines the cases of restrictions on national security, public safety, public order, public health, or morals. So what it seems obvious is that the right to personal freedom is obviously impacted by the containment measures, especially for people who are tested positive to COVID-19 and forced for quarantine. So in these cases, the privation of liberty are not arbitrary at all under Article 9 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Hence to that, we have the Article 5 of the European Human Rights Convention, which admits the lawful detention of persons for the prevention of the spreading of infectious diseases. So I will maybe resume saying that it seems to me today unclear to talk about compliance of the measures put in place in some North African states with the democratic norms or international human rights. And especially that we are still, as we say, in the eye of the cyclone. Nous sommes encore dans l'œil du cyclone. The threat remains, so that we cannot talk about compliance until the measures are lifted after the end of the pandemic. And maybe I will also add that states such as Morocco and Tunisia have and must comply with the conditions and respect the obligations of state of health emergency, among which there is the limit of the time, so that these measures do not have to last longer. The restrictions are not used as pretext to oust opponents of regime or political decision makers, but especially that the artificial intelligence used so far to serve the citizens will not be used after that against them in order to watch them, to track them down, or to use all the data gathered against them after the end of the pandemic. So I might join my voice to Professor Whitehead Lawrence from Oxford University, who said yesterday that we have to wait the end of the pandemic in order to see the effects of the decision, the measures put in place on human rights. That's it. So what I can say is that the future holds the answer. Thank you so much.
شكرا أستاذة مريم، شكرا جزيلا على هذه المداخلة المركزة وأيضا احترام للوقت، فشكرا لك. الآن ننتقل إلى إسبانيا وإيطاليا مع باحثتان أو باحثتين مهتمتين بشؤون شمال إفريقيا والشرق الأوسط، مع بيتريس توم ألونسو وجوليا سيميني. بيتريس هي أستاذ كيميني، أوكي، لأن بالإيطالية كيميني أو كيميني، أوكي. أستاذة بيتريس هي من جامعة لويولا أندلسية، وأستاذة جوليا من جامعة University of بولونيا. عنوان المداخلة باللغة العربية، طبعا سيقدمونها باللغة الإنجليزية. سياسة كوفيد 19 في المغرب، نبيذ قديم في زجاجات جديدة. طبعا هذه ترجمة إلى حد ما يعني حرفية، old wine in new bottles. إذن بيتريز وجوليا لكم الكلمة حسب التنظيم والتقسيم بينكما. اوكي اوكي اوكي، تفضلي بيتريز. يعني لأن مداخلة أوكي. إذن أنتقل مباشرة إلى أمل بوبكر من باريس. أظن أنها جاهزة. أرحب بأمل التي ستتحدث عن الجزائر والكوفيد والحراك، ثورة معلقة. أمل باحثة في مدرسة الدراسات العليا في العلوم الاجتماعية بباريس، فلك الكلمة وتتفضلين. ننتظر بالنسبة للذين يتابعوننا عبر الانترنت ووسائل التواصل الاجتماعي عبر النقل المباشر من خلال صفحتي المؤسستين المحتضنتين لهذا النشاط. ننتظر دقيقتين ليكون المتدخلون جاهزين.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I apologize. It's not that you took me by surprise like the pandemic, but I had a problem with my cam, so I deeply apologize to all my co-panelists and the public. Thanks a lot for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to work with the center and with the foundation. I'm going to present something on Algeria. You know that a bit of context, maybe first you know that Algeria has experienced mass demonstration kind of revolution since February 2019. Of course, we had repression. It's important to underline, didn't start with the confinement, but started early on, and so Algerians took the street a week after the other, and finally decided, especially members of the Hirak, the so-called the name that has been given to this mass movement of millions of people who have been demonstrating twice a week for almost a year and a half. In March, they decided to put the demonstrations on hold due to the pandemic situation and of course to the dangers of public safety reasons. So that was a decision that was taken by people who identify themselves with the Hirak themselves. It was not imposed upon them by the state or the Algerian regime. But of course, suddenly the kind of the paradigm that emerged was, will this stopping of demonstrations benefit the regime? Will the regime try to use the opportunity of not having any more demonstrations and no more pressure then, because the demonstrations were really the main tool for pressure of the Algerian people upon or on the Algerian state and the Algerian regime. So that was the kind of question and the kind of probability we had. I would say that trying to understand the future of the Hirak, and of course people were questioning the future of the Hirak. Will the Hirak be able to go on without demonstrations? I would say that trying to understand the future of the Hirak in terms of failure or success against the ruling elite, as the regime does actually, the regime who was trying to think about the pandemic that way, is a bit misleading, and I would like to explain why. Well, first, the idea that Algeria is worthy of interest only if a radical change occurs is actually a paradigm that has been applied to the country even before the Hirak started. You remember we were asking why there's no Arab kind of Arab Spring Revolution in that came to Algeria. Why is Bouteflika reigning or has been reigning over the country for almost 20 years, with Algerians not seeming to, or not apparently putting in question this reign. Well, I would say that if we focus only on radical change, we are missing the point, and we are missing all the interesting dynamics that are actually occurring, and it's a state-centric perspective that is also misleading for our understanding of the pandemic. I think that if we are to focus only on the regime and cynically forget about the people's capability to adapt and survive to this kind of crisis and others, as Algerians did constantly for the past 20 years and even more, we have to understand that the pandemic in Algeria has signed the failure of the populist governance of the regime itself. The fact that because of an economic crisis that came before the COVID crisis, and that has hardly damaged the populist capabilities of the Algerian regime, we will see that the internal logic of the Algerian regime is already crumbling. There's no way for the regime to protect the Algerians in an exclusive way, and even though to protect the Algerians from the Algerians who identify themselves with the Hirak, because that was really the main narrative of the Algerian regime. And this is how the COVID has hit or has damaged or has decredibilized this main source of legitimacy for the Algerian regime. So I will explain a bit how. So what happened actually during the past 9 months? As I said, there was the idea that the Algerian citizens, or the Algerian average citizens, had to take responsibility to protect the other Algerians. And that may sound a bit naive or a bit basics to say it like this, but again, considering the efforts of the Algerian regime to acquire exclusively, or to get this, or to promote its exclusive legitimacy of the one who is capable of protecting the Algerians, that was something important. And what we have seen during the first months of the Hirak is a lot of local initiatives of NGOs, of students, because you know that during the Hirak we had 2 demonstrations, or we have demonstrations twice a week. The Tuesday was usually led by the students and students associations, and the Friday was a bit more diverse, although the Tuesdays became more and more diverse through the past year and past months. So we have seen all these groups, all these social components of the Hirak continuing to mobilize, but focusing their efforts on how to answer the challenges brought by the COVID that the regime was absolutely unable to answer. So, for example, a lot of students have gathered in universities. They have worked on medical apparatus and medical tools like alcoholic gel, but also respiratory machines and so on, that they could provide the Algerian people with. Journalists, who were also an important component of the Hirak, also mobilized in order to give or to provide the Algerian civil society with alternative sources of information, because that's also an important thing to notice is the failure of the Algerian regime to provide or to build some legitimacy on its public communication around the COVID. The government, who actually shut down closed the boundaries and didn't take any kind of the mosques also in the country, the schools of course, but didn't take any real measures or didn't launch any kind of real policies in order to support financially, but also from a public health point of view in public hospitals and so on, at all. Well, the fact that they were totally inefficient led them to communicate actually unrealistic public data, such as the number of deaths and the numbers of people who have been sick and who have contracted the COVID. So what the journalists did and what the press did is that they really tried to provide the Algerian people with alternative sources of information, that even led the then and current Ministry of Communication to forbid any other any independent source to provide the public opinion with figures and data related to the COVID, and that included even public hospitals and doctors working in public hospitals. So this is the only answer that the Algerian regime brought to the pandemic challenges was really a securitarian approach of first the territory and the possibility of and with regard to information, of course, but also to the efforts of the Hirak to shift from demonstrations to charity initiatives, because, as I said, people also, average citizens who used to be part of the Hirak, also tried to help people from deprived regions who were in dire need of financial support. So the struggle went on. Actually, the pandemic didn't harm the Hirak. And didn't prevent its grassroots to continue to oppose the state or to act in a parallel force to the state and to the regime, more precisely. And at the same time, the regime was not, that didn't allow the Hirak to overthrow the regime. That was not the point, and that was not the ambition of Hirakists, as we call them. So I would say that beyond the idea of the regime's maintenance of the ruling elite power over formal politics, because if we look only at formal politics, yes, we will see that the Algerian regime is still in place, that even lately elections for a widely rejected new constitution, but these elections were held and happened, and the constitution has been passed. But if we look at formal politics, yes, we will maybe conclude that no change is happening. But if we like to focus on how the Hirak has been able to answer political needs that have been neglected by the regime, why and how this has allowed its activists to impose themselves also during the pandemic has a de facto political competitors, well, even if the regime remains strong and a global revolution has not taken place yet, this is an important approach that will allow to us to go beyond the idea of who will benefit the Hirak or the regime from the pandemic. So in a nutshell, and to conclude, I would say that if we look what has the Hirak changed so far, and maybe a change that has been reinforced by the pandemic, I would say that it has really created allowed the emergence of an autonomous political space to think about political change. And I would say that during the pandemic, the failure of the populist legitimacy and the populist means of the regime to support economically, but also from a very, in terms of propaganda against external threats and external enemies, I would say that the Hirak has been able to distort and to decredibilize a political space that was exclusively controlled by the regime. I would say that the politicization of social grievances on poor working conditions and salaries, on corruption, on nepotism and recruitment processes, even within public hospital, on the inflation that has been made to the COVID, also on the destruction of public companies in favor of the regime's oligarchs' private interest, or even the awful state of public hospital. Well, the hospitals, all this politicization of social grievances has been made possible by the mobilization of the Hirak. They even speak about Irhad Idari, a kind of administrative or bureaucratic terrorism that to qualify the Algerian regime policies even more during the pandemic. So there's a long-term political impairment and a rupture with the political framework imposed by the regime that we may have seen before the pandemic and during the pandemic. Now, of course, to conclude, there are some challenges that remain. The security repression that my colleague was mentioning before, but again, security repression has not been that efficient. People who have been put in jail have been actually, as soon as they have been freed, continued to join these initiatives to support the people, to protect the people in place and in competition with the state. Now, and that will be my last point, there's also an interesting effect that the COVID and this way to have paused the demonstration has had on the Hirak and the Hiraki activists themselves, is the conclusion that there's a need to think about maybe alternative way to mobilize, and we have seen a lot of local initiatives. That's something that the confinement and the COVID crisis has allowed also, maybe to enlarge the focus not just on national massive demonstrations, but much more local initiatives, and also a reflection on how, not only on how to overthrow the regime and the state, as I said, that has never been the objective of the Hirak, but also on how maybe again, has a look at a local level, Hiraki activists have been able to work with the bureaucracy and to maybe separate the regime, the political regime, and the state elite from the local bureaucracy in order to gain some legitimacy and to achieve some local changes. So yeah, these are maybe some of the reflections I had on how the idea that the revolution is on hold, or the hierarchy has ended, or that the regime, the Algerian regime, is stronger than ever, may be misleading, and how we should focus on really local initiatives and shift the paradigm to understand how these two forces and these two groups may act in the competition and in parallel ways that can be more fruitful even maybe for other case countries. Thank you.
شكرا أمل. ننتقل الآن إلى ألمانيا مع الأستاذ يان فولكل من جامعة فرايبورغ. هو متخصص في قضايا منطقة مينا شمال إفريقيا والشرق الأوسط. عنوان مداخلته كوفيد 19 ومستقبل دراسات شمال إفريقيا، 5 ملاحظات أولية. إذا كنت جاهزا يان فلك الكلمة. Are you ready, Jan?
Yes, it is.
Jan, can you turn the mic? Turn on the mic, because we cannot hear you.
Maybe better now?
Activate the mic, please.
Yeah, I hope it's better.
Yeah,
now.
okay. You can start again.
Yes, please.
Okay.
So good morning from my side to everyone, and thanks to the organizers first, Professor Mohammed El-Hashemi, a good friend of mine since years now, and of course also Steffen Kröger from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and Abir Burg for the organization. I'm very pleased and happy to join the meeting here from Germany. Well, we all are aware that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought massive changes to the whole world. Most of them are rather negative, of course. We are concerned about our health, we are concerned about our economy, and we are also a bit concerned about our political systems. And I'm very grateful for the presentations by Miriam and also by Amal before, because they spoke a lot about things that are also very interesting to me, namely how democracy and autocracy play out in North Africa. But the corona crisis has also brought at least something positive, and I think this is this modern technology that we have all discovered this year, to have these virtual meetings, these online conferences, because I believe a year ago, in 2019, we could not have imagined how wonderful these technologies will be, and also what potential is in these modern technologies. But let me come to my main topic, 5 preliminary observations, which means hypothesis, let's say, what I believe the studies of North Africa, in which way they will be affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. My first point would be, okay, politics, economy, and society in North Africa. And there, I think this panel speaks a lot about this topic. So let me just summarize maybe 2 points that I think are important also from the political science perspective. In general, we assume that times of crises, they are the hour of the executive. So if there's a crisis, whatever nature, this gives a lot of power into the hands of the government, and it usually limits the possibilities of the opposition. And we see that in many countries, including my own one, Germany, or Europe in total, where from the beginning of this year 2020, the governments were in the position to take action, and criticism of potential activities from the governments were largely silenced with the argument, we have to act fast. There's no time for discussion and there's no time for criticism. So that gives probably an exceptional amount of power into the hands of governments also in North Africa. And we already heard that demonstrations have been banned, curfews have been enacted, and probably also abused in the way to control oppositionists and young activists better than already before. But on the other hand, there's also the risk in these crises that people get increasingly frustrated with what their governments are doing. Because the mismanagement, if governments prove unable to handle this crisis and more people slip into poverty or suffer from bad health conditions, so that might mean that higher dissatisfaction rates will be triggered, which then probably lead to an increase in protests. And that means, on the one hand, we can assume the governments are getting more powerful, probably stricter also in their activities. And at the same time, the dissatisfaction, the frustration among the population will increase. So that might lead to an increased level of conflicts and tension, higher than we already have it before. And when I speak about North Africa, this probably excludes in a way Libya, because with the civil war situation since here, it's of course very difficult to press Libya into this kind of political science schemes of analysis. But I think for the other countries in North Africa, that might be very true. This goes hand in hand with very worrying developments in the economic sector. So also the economies have come under massive pressure. The curfew and the lockdown that has been imposed in many countries has put particular hardships on the small and medium-sized enterprises. A problem that we also face in Germany, if the shops are closed and people cannot go to do their shopping in the cities, what will happen to the small and independent shop owners? or restaurants that are closed, and so on and so forth. So these kind of family-run business might come under immense pressure. And at the same time, as I mentioned, for Germany, the whole continent of Europe is also in economic struggle. And that means if Europe, as a strong economic power in the world, starts to tumble and to fight with its own economic development, this probably has very negative impacts on the economic cooperation and the trade relations between Europe and North Africa. And I think Morocco is a country, Tunisia is a country where many companies depend on trade relations with Europe. And if the demand in Europe declines, this of course might have very harsh consequences for North African economies. And last but not least, and I think we have all witnessed this year, since most people were banned from traveling in order to fight the pandemic, the tourism is at an absolute minimum, and we all know how important the tourism sector is for the economies in Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, and North Africa as such. And finally, a word on the societies that have come under an increasing stress by this already explained political and economic worrying tendencies. So if unemployment increases, many people who still work in formalized jobs, they will probably lose their health insurance, which is often connected to a proper job that one has. And if people lose their health insurance, they will even less refer to medical treatment in case they fall ill. And that means not only the number of deaths related to the COVID-19 pandemic is an issue, but also deaths that or suffering, health-related suffering that might result from the hesitance of people to turn to their doctor because they cannot pay it or because they don't trust that they will not get infected with COVID-19 when they go to the hospital. So the numbers of deaths also from other illnesses might increase. And it seems that most governments in North Africa are financially not prepared enough to give sufficient social support for those people who slip into unemployment, poverty, and that there's not sufficient support from the governments for those. And that means we have the rising pressure from the governments that they get more strict in their actions, but we also have rising pressure on the governments, as I have elaborated at the beginning already. And I think Miriam mentioned the word trust in the beginning of her presentation. And I'm also convinced that the level of trust between the citizens and the politicians or the state is a very crucial indicator when we think about the future developments still during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. So what does this mean for the Euro-Mediterranean relations? The EU is now, let's say, like the rabbit in front of the snake, waiting for the vaccination, which is rolling out this week in the UK. In Russia, we have this alternative vaccine, the Sputnik medication, and in Europe, they all look for this German-US co-produced BioNTech vaccine. And the whole European Union is massively hoping that this vaccination might bring relief to the pandemic and that kind of normality can come back. At the same time, there's, I think, quite a considerable amount of awareness among EU leaders that an equal distribution around the world of this vaccine must be ensured. So there were people saying, well, probably the rich countries, they secure all the doses of vaccine for themselves, and the poorer countries, they will not benefit in the same way. And that might be indeed, at the end of the day, the case. But at least in the speeches, in the solemn speeches, now in the G20, for instance, Angela Merkel and others, they will insist that there need to be a fair share around the world of the existing vaccines. But this comes then to the problem how the vaccines will be distributed within each country. And there, of course, there is the problem if countries suffer from weak political structures and there's a high level of corruption, for instance, the deep state is regulating everything and is deciding everything. We already see, I think in Algeria it has been reported that particularly military hospitals have been upgraded with equipment. Meanwhile, the public hospitals have been largely neglected. I'm not sure if that's still correct, but in the early phases of the pandemic, we could read these analyses. So if a deep state is very strong in the country, the risk is very high that only those who support the regime or that belong to the regime will also benefit from the vaccination once the vaccines are available. So that might be a concern for Europe, for the European Union and its member states, that they see an increase of injustice, social injustice, because this kind of discrimination of people who don't comply to the regime might be discredited from the vaccination. And at the same time, Russia and China, they have already become very important actors in North Africa, China particularly in Algeria, Russia now in Egypt growing. So they might be growing competitors to the European Union. And also, when the public spending of governments in North Africa need to continue to increase because there's economic decline, there's health coverage needed, and so the risk is very high that the government of Egypt, for instance, might turn towards the Chinese government or the Russian government to ask for credits. And so that might bring the European Union more into the backseat when it comes to the future relations. So that means, in my eyes, what we can expect from Europe when it comes to the Mediterranean relations is that they might probably continue to call for good governance, also in times of the pandemic and in the way how to overcome the pandemic. But this will be mainly rhetoric. I believe in actual politics, the hard interests like cooperation in migration, cooperation in fighting terrorism, in whatever we have there, will of course continue to dominate the relations. So that means I don't expect that from the European Union there will be a major trigger coming for how to help the poor compared to how to cooperate, to continue to cooperate with the existing governments in place. So what does this mean, this overall political, economic and social developments in North Africa and in the relations with the European Union for the future of scientists, you and myself and all the others around us, our colleagues? I think social sciences, and I believe most of us here in this conference, we somehow belong to social sciences or to humanities maybe, we will be in an increased competition with our colleagues from the hard sciences. So medical studies get an incredible amount of money now to invest in the research for how to develop medication against COVID-19. And it's of course very good and it's also very important and relevant, but money can be spent only once. So when it comes to applying for research funds and the public budgets for science support will probably be decreasing in future because of the economic problems, I think the donors might increasingly think, well, we should support now with a limited amount of money those disciplines in sciences which are really relevant. And I believe it will be very difficult to convince funding organizations to support area studies in the broadest meaning of its term for the Middle East, North Africa, if there are strong competitors from medical research. And also, I think we will face increasing competition with technologies that try to overcome or to fight climate change, which is also very important. But I believe in social sciences, we need to be more innovative to somehow convince funders that research on traditional lifestyle in Algeria, on the Iraq movement, on the perspectives of young people in Morocco and so on and so forth, that these topics are still perceived as relevant by the science funding organizations. And I believe organizations, by the way, like the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, are very important in this relation because they have this specific focus on societal developments also in the countries. And it will be very important for these organizations like the Konrad Adenauer Foundation that they will be heard in the future, in the upcoming years when it comes to distributing the money for science and research. At the same time, our discipline, let's say the area studies in general, we of course depend a lot on the possibility to travel and also to have an exchange between European universities and North African universities, also within North Africa and so. And as we are all aware, and I think this conference is the best proof, traveling internationally is still very limited, if not impossible. And in future, it will remain more difficult. For two reasons. First, it will take time that the pandemic is definitely over, or that it's definitely under control, let's say, so that normal traveling might be allowed again. But the second thing is, and that really concerns me in the way of global injustice between the North and the South in the world, if you wish. As you're all aware, colleagues from North Africa usually need to apply for visas if they want to visit Europe to come to conferences. Meanwhile, we Europeans, we are privileged that we can simply take our passport and travel to literally almost every country in North Africa and the Middle East without applying for visa. But now is the thing that since Zoom and other conference tools have been proven so successful, that the embassies who are asked to issue the visa might increasingly say, why can't this person participate in this conference through online communication, so the person can stay where he or she is and they can be just switched in like I'm now switched into you. And that means, we discussed this already in Germany, we need to find convincing arguments for the governments, the ministries, that they continue to keep an open visa policy for scientists and students. And I know about the limitations and the problems that we already have, but it must not get even worse, that it's literally impossible to obtain visas for academic cooperation with a, well, stupid argument to say the person can join in from home through online communication. So that means whether one is from Europe or from North Africa, I think we will see an increasing amount of our work done at the own desk at home. And we will have less exposure towards meeting other people, doing first-hand research, going somewhere, sitting with others, discussing things on the ground, for the simple reasons that traveling will be more restricted and more difficult. And that means our discipline will probably see even further shift towards quantitative studies based on empirical data provided by the governments, provided by the World Bank, provided by the United Nations, and less qualitative research, where people go to somewhere and expose themselves and they try to understand how is a certain phenomenon working and how can it be explained. And that, as a convinced qualitative scholar, leaves me, of course, a little bit hopeless when I think about the future of my own discipline. And the last point I want to make is, well, I almost spoke about it, the impact on transformation research. As I already said, I think we will face the problem and we need to find arguments and strategies how to convince decision makers in the political and economic sectors that our political science, social science research on transformation processes will be still relevant and will have its legitimate position in academic exchange and not somehow lose and get into the second or even the third row compared with the hard sciences, which are probably perceived as more relevant. And having said this, that we need to find arguments that we are relevant as social scientists or area study specialists with a focus on North Africa might lead that the hot topics that we have in our scholarship, for instance, outgoing migration from North Africa towards Europe, or the effects of climate change on certain areas in North Africa, but they will be promoted even stronger because the chance to win a research grant on these topics is still comparatively high. But we will at the same time probably see a loss of this kind of exotic research fields, that someone is interested in how people in southern Egypt are doing, and the person wants to go there. So something very specific and what not many people might find really interesting, but it's of course very valid and very important research. But this will become less promoted and less visible in the future of North African studies. So I thank you very much for your attention. I hope you could understand, and that also the interpreters could give a good interpretation for those who feel better in a language other than English. One maybe positive word for the conclusion is, as I've already said, that traveling might remain difficult for the months, if not years to come. There's also a chance in that. In this discussion about global imbalances and injustices in the academic system, so that the northern academics are privileged and the southern academics are very often used just as the support researcher in northern funded research project. I think there's the chance now. If Europeans cannot go to North Africa in the way they were used to, this means they will need to have better cooperation from North African colleagues. And that means I could imagine that in the year to come, we will see also quite some research projects, joint research project funded from a European organization on something going on in North Africa, and that North African scholars from universities in Morocco will be the lead researchers, and they literally are in charge, fully in charge of the research done in their own country or in their own region. And the European colleagues are, at the end of the day, on an equal level, so we will see truly collaborative research, and not in the way that we often, and too often in my eyes, see it, that the Europeans come to somewhere in North Africa and the North African colleagues are just their assistants in a way. So that is my glimpse of a hope, in an otherwise rather negative outlook for the future of North African studies. Thank you very much.
شكرا يان، شكرا جزيلا، وشكرا أيضا على اقتراحاتك القيمة. بالمناسبة يان متخصص بتحولات في شمال إفريقيا والشرق الأوسط، وأيضا بسياسة الاتحاد الأوروبي، سياسة الجوار في الاتحاد الأوروبي. ننتقل الآن إلى إيطاليا مع جوليا كيميني، وأيضا بمداخلة مشتركة مع بياتريس تومي ألونسو، باحثتان أيضا تهتمان بقضايا شمال إفريقيا والشرق الأوسط، فيمكن أن تطلعوا على دراستهما في مواقع مختلفة على الإنترنت. دراسة قيمة تهتم بمختلف الشؤون السياسية والأمنية والاجتماعية بالمنطقة. مداخلتهما بعنوان سياسة كوفيد 19 في المغرب، نبيذ قديم في زجاجات جديدة. ستتولى جوليا من جامعة بولونيا بإيطاليا تقديم المداخلة، أما باتريس فهي أستاذة بجامعة لويولا بأندلسيا بإسبانيا. إذن جوليا لك الكلمة، فتفضلي مشكورة.
Thank you very much, sir, and good morning to everyone. This is really a pleasure to be with you this morning, although only virtually, unfortunately. And let me thanks, first of all, Professor Alashimi and all those working with him for making my participation possible as well. And apologies for this delay, but this morning we had in Italy such storm, and so electricity cuts and connection is really, really bad. I will try to shorten my presentation and to talk as slowly as possible so that the task for the interpreters will be easy. I prepare a PowerPoint presentation, so I will try to switch, or apparently, no, I have problems in switch. Let me say sorry. Okay, no, I cannot switch to the presentation, but perhaps you have it. So if you want to display the presentation on the screen, I send the presentation to Mrs. Abir. Otherwise, I will continue without it. Do you have it? Okay, I will go without the presentation.
So the presentation Professor Tomé Alonso and I prepared revolved around the following question. How did the emergence of an unexpected and non-traditional security threat, such as the COVID-19, affect Morocco's national politics? So our main argument is that the management of the crisis can be framed in terms of securitization. And let me jump directly to the conclusion to give you the whole picture. So we found that securitizing the pandemic has been instrumental to consolidate traditional power dynamics and the related tendency to technocratization. In particular, the palace distinguished itself for being the most proactive and important and relevant actor at the detriment of parliament and government. So it was then a missed opportunity for other institutional actors, like political parties, to recover their legitimacy and claim for a greater role. The COVID-19 exposed everywhere how fragile even the most developed countries can be in the face of a virus that knows no borders, and pointed to the multidimensional effect and impacts of infectious disease, which by their very nature lend themselves particularly well to securitization dynamics. But what does securitization mean? We have to go back to the Copenhagen school when that stresses that security is about survival and it is socially constructed. So a security concern must be articulated as an existential threat that requires emergency measures and justifies action outside the normal bounds of political procedure. And how does it happen? Through discourses, through what is called a speech act that socially constructs a threat. So in this sense, the securitization process dramatizes politicized and non-politicized issues as issues of supreme priority that need to be dealt with urgency, extraordinary countermeasures, and even allow for breaking the normal democratic rule. So with the spread of the coronavirus, these processes are extremely topical to see not only how the main threat, that is at the origin, and health threat, is identified, but also to what extent it ends up to include a number of secondary issues for instrumental purposes. So in so doing, we argue, failures to guarantee the right to health can be more easily justified, and the right to health becomes instrumental to restrict other rights, as for instance, the freedom of speech. Yesterday, there were other participants who highlighted this aspect and, for instance, mentioned the proposed law 22.20, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, this process of securitization is not automatic. So the act of securitization is successfully only once the relevant audience has been convinced of the existential threat. So in our particular case, in Morocco, we suggest that the COVID-19 has been securitized by central authorities, and this not only happened in Morocco, it happened in other countries in North Africa, in other countries in Europe, and elsewhere internationally. So the COVID has been framed as a threat to both citizens and the nation. And since it is a discursive phenomenon, its meaning is negotiated every day by a plurality of stakeholders like politicians, other experts, journalists, institutions. So in other ways, the way in which the threat and the responses to it are framed, constructive and discursively addressed by whom and for whom, is part and parcel of the crisis management as a whole, and not least of healthcare itself. So it is, in a way to fight the virus, but outside, for instance, a hospital. So not surprisingly, if you consider all the discourses, the official discourses by authorities, by the media, it is very common to find a war-related terminology. So it is, there's this emphasis on the idea of a battle, of a fight, of a war, that it is an exception, that we are on an emergency. So by analyzing official discourses, we found particularly interesting two aspects. Firstly, the transfer of responsibility away from authorities to the citizenry, or at least to part of it, according to a rhetoric approach that is by no means exclusive to Morocco, but that was widely used internationally. So on this occasion, irresponsible citizens are blamed and held accountable of a possible recrudescence of the pandemic or of any problems that there might be in facing the issues itself. Secondly, and in parallel with the securitization process, this rhetoric leaves no room for questioning either the current choices or those choices that in the past have led to the present crisis. So while Morocco successfully avoided major outbreak during the first wave of the pandemic, it nonetheless saw a significant increase in the number of cases, especially during the summer. So although those numbers are not as high as in neighboring Europe, Morocco emerged as the second African country with more confirmed cases of COVID. So extraordinary measures were taken on several fronts. I don't have to recall them here, of course, but I would like to highlight the centrality and relevance of the Palace in kickstarting these initiatives, in coordinating and monitoring all the most important initiatives. Like, for instance, the creation of a special fund to alleviate the economic consequences of the pandemic, the mobilization of the military personnel and infrastructure to help the ordinary public health system, the royal amnesty, the repatriation of Moroccan citizens stranded abroad after the border closure. And as we said yesterday, freedom of expression sometimes was also collateral damage in this situation. But another important aspect is that the securitization favored the emergence of an unquestionable technical knowledge. So technical figures overshadow political ones who acted more as validators of decision. So of course, in times of crisis, in times of emergency, it is important to rely on experts because of their particular specific expertise. But it is equally important that other political, especially representative actors, appear as legitimate, responsible, and accountable political actors. So that is why I said at the beginning that was a missed occasion for representative institutions and political parties, which already enjoy very low levels of confidence by citizens, to increase their legitimacy by taking responsibility of action. So I will stop here to leave space for the discussion. Professor Beatrice Ibu could not be able to connect as well, so apologies from her side as well. But I thank you for your attention and sorry for the presentation. I thought it could have been possible to show the presentation I sent directly by you, but I hope that the public could follow my speech. Thank you very much.
شكرا يوليا، ونرجو أن نراكم قريبا هنا في المغرب. الدكتور الهاشمي كان يتمنى ذلك وحاول، لكن الظروف الحجر الصحي هي التي حالت دون ذلك. نتمنى أن نرى الأصدقاء الذين شاركوا معنا افتراضيا قريبا في المناسبة القادمة. إذن بعد هذه المداخلات القيمة لمريم وأمل ويان وجوليا أفتح مجال للمناقشة، فمن له مداخلة فليتفضل.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. Just to say hi to our friends and colleagues from Germany and Volkan, from Italy, Giulia Chimini, and from France, our Algerian colleague and friend Amal Boubkar. And I want just to say that Professor Al-Arbi Sadiqi from Doha was facing some problems in connecting to Zoom, and he will be joining us within 1 hour. So right after the discussion and the coffee break, Professor Sadiqi will be giving his keynote speech. I want to interact with the three panelists, starting with Professor Al-Khadar. And this is the question I want to address to both of you, to Madam Al-Khadar and to Giulia as well, because they have presented on some aspects that deals with the way Morocco has been dealing with the pandemic. I don't think there was some kind of serious issues with the way Morocco handled the situation from a human rights perspective. Maybe there was some problems with the implementation of these. I am not defending the Moroccan regime, of course, but I was just saying that I was somehow monitoring or observing the decision-making process and the decisions that were taken by different levels of decision-making in Morocco. I could say that the only problem maybe is with the way some of the people who are on the low level of the decision-making process, those who implement the decisions to be more precise, more accurate, they implemented the decisions in the way that maybe lead to some kind of abuses. And this was actually reported by human rights organizations, Moroccan ones, and the United Nations as well. There is also one concern with maybe the fact that the Moroccan state did not notify the limitations on the human rights according to Article 4 of the Covenant, International Covenant on Economic and on economic and social rights. The states may subject some rights only to such limitations that are, or as I am citing, as are determined by law only insofar as this may be compatible with the nature of those rights and solely for the purpose of promoting the general welfare in a democratic society. So this is the principle here, is every single state member of the United Nations who ratified these covenants is allowed to put some limitations that are justified by exceptional conditions in order to deal with exceptional situations. So I don't think there is a problem on the principle of limiting some rights. But the problem is that I think the same maybe article or another one provides for the necessity that states who put limitations on their commitments on some of their of the rights, of the basic human rights, should notify this to the General Secretary of the United Nations. Morocco did not, at least to my knowledge. And the Moroccan authorities, of course, justified this decision. They have their own justifications. So I don't think there is a problem with this, except, of course, the way the decisions were implemented. There was serious abuses in terms of arresting people in such an arbitrary way. But this is not a problem of decision making, but the problem of implementing. This is another issue. Another question to Julia. I don't think there is something new with the centrality of the Moroccan monarchy, because it's a fact, and it has been a fact decades ago, maybe centuries ago, that Moroccan monarchy is the central and key institution. So I don't think there is something new in this. Maybe the exceptional situation has made this centrality more prominent, but I don't think there is something new in this. And I want just to point out to a work that was, or a report that was published by, I don't remember exactly, in UK. I don't remember the institution that published this report, that compares centralized versus decentralized powers in the world. And the conclusion was that centralized powers or centralized systems were more effective in dealing and successful in dealing with the pandemic than decentralized powers. And the UK government and the US government were actually criticized for this, and the criticism was explained somehow by the fact that they are very decentralized. Very final question, I'm sorry for the delay. The very final question to Amal Bubkar. Do you think that the pandemic is likely to end the Hirak, or it will maybe have a new momentum after the pandemic ends, especially in light of the precarious conditions, health conditions of the president, and the fact that the new regime seems to have fallen short from satisfying the needs and the expectations, meeting the expectations of the Algerian people? Thank you.
تفضل.
شكرا. أنا يعني لدي ملاحظات تشمل المداخلات، يعني تقريبا المداخلات كلها. كيف تدبر الأنظمة السلطوية شرعيتها في ظل الأزمات وأزمات كبرى مثل الأزمة ديال كوفيد 19. في الحقيقة ما أثار انتباهي جدا هو أننا نتحدث عن الأنظمة السلطوية فقط بمؤشرات التعسف والاعتقال وتكميم حرية التعبير، في الوقت اللي الأنظمة السلطوية أولا السلطوية ليست جوهر، هي دينامية. كل نظام سلطوي كيدبرها بسياقة. نرجعوا للمغرب. في المغرب يعني وانا كنتفق مع الاستاذ الهاشمي حول مداخله الاخت من ايطاليا، يعني ليس هنالك جديد. الأحزاب السياسية لم تكن يوما ما فاعلة لا في المجال السياسي ولا والملك لم يفقد يوما مركزيته لا السياسية ولا الاقتصادية، بمعنى أن يعني الأمر في الجائحة من هذا النظر الوضعية الملكية في الجائحة من هذه الزاوية يعني لم يحمل جديدا. فرأيي الشيء اللي تغفل النظام السلطوي في المغرب هو نظام سلطوي عنده أسس تقليدية، لأن كاين أنظمة سلطوية التي ليست لها أسس تقليدية. من زاوية النظر هذه هنالك فقط أريد أن أشير إلى 3 نقاط. الذي أضافته أزمة كورونا للنظام السلطوي بالمغرب وأفقدته أشياء وأضافت أشياء كتمثل في 3 النقاط. أولاها هي أن النظام السلطوي في المغرب جدد أركان سلطويته التقليدية عبر 3 عناصر. العنصر الأول هو مسرحة السلطة، لا تياتراليزاسيون دو بوفوار، واللي هي مكون أساسي للأنظمة السلطوية التقليدية. فين كتبان مسرحة السلطة؟ مسرحة اللحظة اللي نزل الجيش المدن وبدا كيمر من 5 د العشية، على الأقل حنا عندنا فاس من 5 د العشية ل5 د العشية، وسيارة الإسعاف والصافير والوقفة إلى غير ذلك. فعلا الأستاذة مريم ما كانش العصا، حنا ولفنا ملي كينزل الجيش لهذا يا انقلاب يا انتفاضة ولكن الناس كانت كتخرج كتطلل من البالكون، من لي بالكون، وكانت الزغاريد، وهذه كلها مؤشرات ديال مؤشرات ديال بحال سلطان الطلبة هو في صراع معسكرة. يعني هذه النقطة الأولى، يعني واللي شحال هذه ما شفناها، وفي ظل الأزمة غتغيب تماما لأن الحشود ممنوعة. ولكن كيف يجدد هذا الأساس التقليدي اللي هو النواة لو نويو دور كثار من التعسف والاعتقال. النقطة رقم 2 هي الطقوسي في جميع المدن، والطقوس كما خدم عليها روني جيرار وخدموا عليها وحدين اخرين كثر من روني جيرار معدية. بدا الطقس في مدينة واحد الساعة بدا كينتشر. شنو هو الطقس؟ هو أنه وطقس بالأساس الأمني دائما، هو أن جميع التخصصات رجال الأمن كيدخلوا قلب الأحياء وكيصطفوا بنظام وكيخرجوا الناس وكينشدوا النشيد الوطني. سي ان غيت اللي ترسخ. النقطة الثالثة والأخيرة واللي أيضا الانتباه لها هو أن كان هنالك خطاب للملك اللي هو جاب مناسبة ثورة الملك والشعب، والأنظمة السلطوية التقليدية إلى جانب الطقوسي ولا تياتراليزاسيون كتستعمل التاريخ، طبعا بقراءة أسطورية للتاريخ. الملكيات كلها فيها جانب أسطوري. شنو هو هذا؟ هو تحويل خطاب ديال ثورة الملك والشعب من الحديث على الماضي ديال المغاربة فقط، ولكن الحديث على الماضي ديال المغاربة بربطه بالحاضر ديال الأزمة ديال كوفيد، وإعادة إنتاج أن المغاربة دائما كانوا في التاريخ متضامنون، والأمر لن يصدقه أي مؤرخ. كيفاش يضفى الطابع على واحد الأسطورة سميتها المغاربة في التاريخ، وتستمد منها الملكية قوتها الرمزية. إذن 3 ديال العناصر كان ممكن نضيفوا 3 ديال العناصر فقط صافي غنختم. يعني السلطويات قد تتآكل بالتعسف وبالمنع وبالمواجهة، ولكنها تتجدد بالرمز اللي من ضمنه هذه العناصر. وشكرا.
Thank you, Sinurdin. By the way, Sinurdin is a sociologist at سيدي محمد بن عبد الله University in Fez. الإخوان الذين يتدخلون لاحقا من الأفضل قدموا أنفسكم حتى يتعرف عنكم الأصدقاء الذين يشاركون عبر الإنترنت. عبد الجبار لك الكلمة. أم مصطفى؟ كنشوف كثير قدامي ونسيته. سي مصطفى.
Donc, je pense que je préfère de ne pas intervenir tout de suite, parce que l'analyse que je vais porter, elle est liée à l'intervention d'Yali tout à l'heure. Donc, je préfère de ne pas... Mais sinon, il faut noter qu'il y a un problème, il y a un réflexe spontané que je constate dans la réflexion académique autour de style de management public par rapport à la crise de Covid. Au Maroc, je pense qu'il y a un problème. Il y a un réflexe spontané de convoquer une analyse déjà définie dans l'histoire de développement des recherches académiques sur la question marocaine, sur l'évolution du système politique. Et je ne pense pas que cette variante reste juste et équitable en termes de l'évaluation de la qualité d'intervention managériale publique au Maroc sur la question de la gestion. بعد أنا غادي نحاول نعطي هذه les indicateurs parce qu'il y a un problème sur cette question.
شكرا مصطفى يحيوي is professor of geopolitics at Hassan Singh University in محمدية. سي عبد الجبار لك الكلمة.
شكرا سيد رئيس عراش. عبد الجبار أستاذ باحث بالكلية الجديدة القديمة للعلوم القانونية والسياسية بجامعة الحسن الأول بسطات. إذا كان لي أن أحاول استخراج قاسم مشترك وفكرة أساسية للمداخلات الأربع، فسوف أجدني مضطرا للوقوف عند ضرورة التوفيق ما بين الحرية والأمن. وحتى المداخلة الرابعة لصديق العزيز إيان كذلك تتحدث بشكل أو بآخر عن الأمن وما يترتب عن الأمن من أمننا ارتباطا بالحرية خصوصا في شقها الأكاديمي والعلاقات ما بين الباحثين بين الضفتين. ارتباطا به لدي سؤالين اثنين بنوع من العجالة. السؤال الأول هو موجه للأستاذة الخضر. أعتقد الأستاذة مريم الخضر حينما تحدثت عن نجاح السلطوية وفشل الديمقراطية رغم تكامل كما ذكر الأستاذ زاهي رغم تكاملية هذين المتغيرين إن صح التعبير المتناقضين بشكل أو بآخر. هناك تكاملية لكن ألا يعد يعني الحديث عن فشل أو عن إخفاق الديمقراطيات ومقابله عن نجاح النمط السلطوي نوعا من تكريس ما سماه الأستاذ نور الدين الزاهي يعني تكريس الرمزية كذلك ويعني الدخول في نوع من تسويق حتى لا أقول تبرير لسياسات سلطوية يعني لم تميز ما بين تقييد الحريات وما بين التضييق عليها. تقييد الحريات والتضييق على هذه الحريات. السؤال الثاني أوجهه أنا للأستاذة الباحثة أمل بوبكر كذلك في ذات الصدد فيما يتعلق بهذا الحراك بالجزائر واعتبار هذا الأخير ارتباطا بهذه الأزمة العالمية الصحية التي تعد نتاجا مجتمعيا على حد قول أحد علماء الاجتماع الألمان أولريش بيك في كتابه أعتقد ريزيكو جزيلشافت سوسيتي دو ريسك أو إذا صحت الترجمة عن الألمانية. أقول إلى أي مدى يمكن اعتبار يعني هذا الحراك خصوصا في مضمونه الذي يعري عن متناقضات ممارسات السلطة السياسية بكل إخفاقاتها على المستوى التدبيري السياسي الحقوقي، إلى أي مدى يمكن اعتبار هذا الحراك ورسملته يعني كتقوية لمطالب هذا الحراك خصوصا أمام هذه الجائحة، جائحة كوفيد؟ شكرا.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. تحية للجميع. نبيل زكاوي، أستاذ العلوم السياسية والعلاقات الدولية بجامعة سيدي محمد بن عبد الله. صراحة أريد أن أعود إلى فكرة طرحها الأستاذ نور الدين الزاهي، وأريد أن أعبر على عدم اتفاقي معها. هي فكرة تأويله لنزول الجيش إلى الشارع في سياق مكافحة وباء كورونا بما سماه مصلحة السلطة. ربما هذا من حقه من زاوية النظر السوسيولوجية، ولكن من زاوية نظر علم السياسة هذا يمكن أن نعتبره اندماج مدني عسكري، أو ما يسمى في العلاقات المدنية العسكرية، وهذا جانب أهتم به، التعاون الأمني العسكري. وربما كان هذا أحد العوامل التي جعلت المقاربة المغربية لمكافحة الوباء يعني تنجح نسبيا. أريد أن أعود إلى فرضية الورقة التي قامت عليها، أو الفرضية التي قامت عليها ورقة الزميلة مريم الخضر، على أساس نجاح الأنظمة السلطوية في مكافحة وباء كورونا. أعتبر بأن هذه الفرضية لها حجيتها أو جاذبيتها حتى ربما في الأحوال العادية، وهذا يجرنا إلى نقاش العلاقة بين الديمقراطية والتنمية، أو ما نسميه في المغرب معادلة التنمية بدون ديمقراطية. تابعنا مثلا كيف يعني تحقق مستوى مرتفع من التنمية في الصين من خلال ما يسمى بالتنمية السلطوية. كذلك يمكن أن ندرج نموذج ما يسمى بالاستبداد الكفء في بعض دول آسيا. إذن صراحة ربما هذا التفسير هذا يعني هو نسبيا إلى حد ما صائب على الأقل في حالة الأزمة. شكرا.
شكرا لبودريس بالعيد، باحث في الفلسفة وعلوم التربية وتدريس وديداكتيك الأمازيغية. شكرا لجميع المتدخلين اللي يعني سلطوا العديد من الأضواء الحالة ديال المغرب. وكنعتقد بأن رصد ما وقع وما يقع وما مازال سيقع مع كورونا يمكن نميزوا فيه بين جوج على الأقل جوج ديال المستويات. كاين هذاك المستوى الظاهر هو اللي تيبان، وبحال دابا شبكة التواصل الاجتماعي عطات واحد العدد كبير ديال الخروقات، سواء تاع رجال السلطة، سواء ديال شفنا السردين مثلا تتبعاز، شفنا الناس كتشنق عليها، شفنا واحد العدد كبير ديال الممارسات اللي انا كنظن، وحتى ماشي شخصيا ولكن حتى ايضا حتى التحليل، هو ان اللي جديد في هذا الشيء هذا هو ان الانسان كيشعر بان هناك واحد الوعي بان الخرق راه خرق. وكنعتقد بان هذه من الاشياء اللي جديده، صافودير ان الناس كتعرف شنو هو الخرق وكتحتج عليه، وكاين احتجاجات شويه نقولوا حنا زعما صريحه. وحتى رجال السلطه اللي جديد هو انهم ولاو ملي كيديروا الخرق تيعرفوه بانه خرق. ودونك بحال الا كاين واحد النوع نتاع ديال الوعي الجديد بالحقوق. مازال خصنا الفعليه وما الى ذلك. هذا نقولوا حنا الجزء الاول هو المظهر الاول هو باين تقريبا. خصنا شويه نتاع الاليات نتاع الرصد باش ما تم رصدوه ما يكونش شخصي ويكون شويه تيقرب من الموضوعيه. ولكن كاين واحد الجانب اخر اللي ما انتبهنا ليش ولا الانتباه ليه كان قليل، وهو هذاك الجانب الخفي، هو هذاك الحوايج اللي كان خصها دار وما دارتش، ولانها ما دارتش تسمات خرق. بحال دابا واحد الناس كانوا ممنوعين باش يحلوا الحوانت، ولكن الباعة المتجولين ملي كانوا كيتطلقوا راه ما كانوش كيتطلقوا في ظروف صحيه. صافي بان ما اتخذتش اجراءات، هي نفس الزحام اللي كان وهذاك الناس مجموعين ومزاحمين على هو نفسه. الور كان هما مجموعين هنا وهذا المكان كامل هو خاوي، وكان ممكن باش السلطه تنظم هذاك دير هذاك المتر ولا 2 متر وما الى ذلك. ايضا كاينه اشياء اللي ما كتبانش، بحال دابا بالنسبه مادام كنهضروا في التحسيس، الاذاعه والتلفزيون ديال الامازيغيه ما كانوش كي بنفس المواكبه ديال التحسيس. يعني ما كانوا ملي كيبغيو يحسوا تيهضروا مع الناس بالعربيه، والحال انهما ما تيفهموش هذاك التحسيس. دونك اطول مده نتاع التحسيس، وهذا الشيء عندي معبور، كانت بالعربيه، وهذاك لي كابسول ديال الامازيغيه كانوا قصيورين وقلال من ناحيه الكم ومن ناحيه الكيف. دونك كاين واحد العدد ديال القهاوي اللي مثلا انا عرفت شخصيا اللي مقدم منعهم باش يطلقوا الراديو، باش يطلقوا الموسيقى. تلفزيون الى حد ما ممكن، لان الناس غيتزاحم باش تتفرج في الكره، ولكن الموسيقى علاش؟ يعني هذوك الناس اللي تمنعوا اللي تلاقيت بهم انا هما واحد 5 ديال القهاوي ما فهموش علاش. دونك كنعتقد انا بان الرصد الا بغى يخرج من الجانب الذاتي للجانب الموضوعي خصو امكانيات كبيره، وخصو فريق ديال العمل اللي من ناحيه الكم غادي يقد يغطي رقعه يعني ممثله، ولكن من ناحيه الكيف يقد يغطي لنا هذاك الشيء اللي ظاهر معروف حتى دوليا وحتى تاريخيا في المغرب. ولكن الاشياء اللي كانت بحال نقولها حنا ماشي باطنيه، ولكن ما كتبانش للعين المجرده، اللي خصها شويه نتاع ادوات جديده باش تبان. شكرا.
شكرا. اسماعيل حمودي، أستاذ العلوم السياسية في الكلية المتعددة التخصصات تازا. سؤالي الأول للأستاذة أمل بوكر، وهو سؤال مباشر. هل تعتقدين أن إذا كانت جائحة كورونا قد عززت من قوة النظام السياسي الجزائري، فهل تتوقعين أن تساهم نهاية هذه الجائحة في تراجع هذا النظام عن المساحات التي احتلها خلال هذه الفترة؟ وبمعنى آخر، هل يمكن أن نتوقع استمرار الاحتجاجات، استمرار الحراك الشعبي في الجزائر بعد نهاية كورونا؟ السؤال الثاني للأستاذة ألونسو، هو من المعروف جوليا كيميني، هو من المعروف أن جائحة كورونا اقتضت يعني هي ظرف استثنائي في العالم كله، وبالتالي كل الدول بما فيها الديمقراطية والليبرالية فرضت إجراءات عززت من المساحة الأمني وقلصت من مساحة الحرية وحقوق الإنسان. نحن في ظروف استثنائية. هل وبصيغة أخرى هل يمكننا أن نصنف جائحة كورونا غير التصنيف الذي صنفته دول العالم اليوم، هو أنها تهديد صحي أمني؟ هل يمكن أن نصنفها تصنيفا آخر غير هذا التصنيف؟ وبالتالي الإشكال الذي يعني خلقته عندي المداخلة ديال الأستاذة جوليا هو هل في الظروف الاستثنائية هذه، في ظل الجائحة، في ظل هذا التهديد الأمني الذي فرض فرضا يعني على البشرية جمعاء، هل يمكننا أن نطبق نظرية مثل نظرية الأمننة؟ ونحن نعرف أن هذه النظرية تطبق في اتساع أمننة القضايا، أمننة الظواهر الاجتماعية أو الصحية أو غيرها، غالبا ما تتم في ظروف عادية وليست في الظروف الاستثنائية كما نعيشها اليوم في العالم كله. شكرا.
I give 3 minutes to each speaker to interact and answer questions of the audience. I start with مريم. تفضلي.
Bismillah, thank you so much for the questions. Actually, it is a fact that local authorities resorted to some abusive arrests, especially against people who didn't comply or didn't respect the curfews or containments. And I agree with you, Professor Hashimi, when you said that the Moroccan government didn't notify any abuses to the High Commissioner of Human Rights. But in fact, there are several journalists reported some arbitrary arrests, such as the case of Abu Naim, the Salafist preacher Abu Naim, who was arrested in the 17th March and sentenced to 1 year prison simply because he challenged the decision of the government to close mosques. He was actually put in prison for inciting hatred and disturbing public order. Journalists declared that Abu Naim has been actually in the crosshairs of the local authorities for a while, and the government used what he said just to justify to put him in jail. Second of all, you said مسرحة السلطة. Actually, in this case, the security dimension adopted by the Moroccan government reflected a new approach to security. Actually, as said my colleague Nabil, the security institution on the name of national security, gendarmerie, auxiliary forces, and the army, actually they were engaged in different ways, combining the security, the purely security dimension, roadblocks, checkpoints, and so forth, with the dimension of communication and awareness, hence to the fact that they acted as mediators in number of situations. This is why they acted that way. The third, I think, question, it was about السلطوية. Actually, when I talked about authoritarianism versus democracy, it was mainly because the paper that I submitted to the committee was, at the beginning, talked about the success of Eastern Asian countries faced the COVID-19 and why some democratic states failed to do so. To talk about that briefly, I tried to answer a question which was raised by several scholars and journalists: why authoritarian China could get rid of COVID-19. And I said that it is not about political regime, it is not about politics, but there is a combination of different things. First of all, there is a mentality, an authoritarian mentality. Most of the Eastern Asian states were at the basis authoritarian regimes, even though they went through the transitology process, the transition towards democracy, as declared by, as presented by Hegel, as presented by Huntington, and another name that I'm forgetting now, but these states actually didn't fail like others, because there is, as I said, the authoritarian mentality. There is a common spirit among these states, which is the Confucius spirit, which prevails the holism, the collectivism on individualism, the group instead of the individualistic perception. And last, we have the artificial intelligence. They had a very important leap in the artificial intelligence, which helped them actually to counter the threat of COVID-19. And last, they learned, they have a very good experience. Actually, they learned from previous experiences 2003, 2002, the SARS-CoV, the MERS, Ebola, H1N1. So they strengthened the health sector. They created several laboratories and engaged severely in that way. This is what explains exactly the success of the Eastern Asia faced to democratic states.
Thank you, Miriam. Amal, the floor is yours if you are ready. Amal. Okay, Jan, are you ready, I think? Okay. You can intervene now if you are ready. Jan. Okay, Jan, welcome. شوفي لك please activate your mic. Jan, are you ready? Can you start, please? Jan, can you hear me? No. Amal, Julia. Please activate your mic, please. Okay. يمكن. Okay. We try to fix the problem. مداخلة كانت غنية رائعة ممتازة، أنا استمتعت بها. بالمناسبة مريم أستاذة معنا في القانون العام، وهي اشتغلت على securitization. لا دابا بيريفيري لا دابا كيجريو عليهم يمشيو بيريفيري بين قوسين. أكادير ما شاء الله الباحثين، مراكش، وجدة، فاس. نعم.
أنا فهمت. في محمدية عندكم